Hi, everyone. My name is Wednesday. I'm a media specialist here at Lowell Telemedia Center, and you're watching the Lowellian. Today, we're talking to Sarah, who is visiting Lowell to work on a few different projects, including a soundscape and a podcast. Sarah, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to Lowell?
Yeah. So I'm a PhD in English. I got my degree at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I specialize in 19th century American literature and culture. But I also come from a neighborhood in Chicago that was very much like Lowell, another kind of industrial planned town. It's Pullman, now Pullman National Historical Park. And I started working with Pullman National Historical Park as a graduate student, and then came to Lowell through a fellowship program that is funded by the Mellon Foundation and places humanities PhDs with national park sites to do new research and come up with new interpretive products.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you tell us a little bit about the projects you're working on that are sort of Lowell specific, perhaps starting off with the soundscape, because it's a really, really fascinating project.
Yeah, so the Soundscape project is trying to think about how the story of the Industrial Revolution is told here in Lowell. A lot of times, the sort of narrative arc of that story is what was East Chelmsford, had some farmers along the river, and then these big textile corporations came in, and that sort of that was the blooming of Lowell, right? There was all this production. There were these, big buildings being built, and this influx of female workers, the mill girls. So we wanted to try and figure out how might we reframe that story? How might we look at labor history differently? And we decided to do that through sound, to try and expand the historical scope of that story, to bring in the experiences and lifeways of the indigenous people who were here even before the farmers, right? All the way up to present day with preservation. So we have paired up with 6 different composers who are creating original musical compositions that incorporate sounds of labor from roughly defined periods where there might have been significant changes in how work was defined and what it sounded like.
So it sounds like it's structured into these 6 different pieces that have different focuses. So can you tell us a little bit more about these pieces?
Yeah, so we tried to identify points where the soundscape of what is now Lowell would have changed in significant ways. So when the English settlers came and established farms, they also established small mills. So there was a grist mill here, and that would have changed sort of sonic landscape. Then when the textile mills come in, the big textile mills come in, that's a huge transformation in the sound. If you've ever gone into the weave room at the Boot Cotton Mills Museum, that's the sonic landscape. So instead of a couple of mills dotting the river, suddenly it takes over. The grist mill and the water wheel. We can sort of like hear those. They're kind of like whooshing sounds, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you sort of get that in some of the later sounds. Even just the sound of a cart going down a hallway can be kind of reminiscent of a whooshing sound, just because it sort of has that sort of resonance to it. So yeah, it was a lot of fun, just sort of like hunting down different sounds and going and doing field recordings. So that's been a really interesting aspect of the project as well. It's not just the sounds themselves, but the speed of the sounds that that determine sort of like the pace of work.
Yeah. So one of the things you mentioned a couple times was labor and work, and how it seems like our relationship with work has shifted. And so I'm curious about, like, through this project and maybe prior in your research before, how can we think about like the traditional framing of like the work that we do?
Generally, when we think about work, the definition of work that we have in our heads is something that comes directly out of industrialization. So work is something that happens outside of our home. It happens at particular specified times, right? You start work at it for the mill girls. You start work at like 5 a.m. and you end at 7 or whatever. And it's sort of, and it's also separate from, other aspects of our life, like our spiritual lives. And that isn't the case for work that happens before the Industrial Revolution. It is tied, it is domestic. There is no such thing as sort of a distinct domestic labor, right? There are certainly, gender roles, of course, that exist before the Industrial Revolution, but yeah, the work happens in a much more sort of organic ways. It's seasonal, and it's also more more connected to like subsistence, right? So you're working in order to be able to create a life for yourself, and sometimes you're maybe taking like growing crops that can be sold at a market, or can be sold within your community, or like early weaving. They would have basically weavers in homes creating the goods that could be sold later, but it was a much more spread out system. So yeah, and then once we get into something like the 20th century, early 20th century, then we get like Taylorism, which is the more like scientific monitoring of production of workers. So in something like weaving, you have like counters of like how many how many picks you wove that day, right? So you can measure things. So you can think about that in like places like Starbucks, where they know to the second how long it takes to make a drink, and they know like exactly where to put an employee so that they have to take the fewest amount of steps to finish an order. Like that all comes from like early 20th century scientific mechanization of work. So yeah, and now we have technology, right? New technologies of remote work and things like that.
Yeah, as you're describing the different stages and ways that we can think of it, I was trying to like almost hear in my head like the sound of weaving, or like as we were having this conversation about soundscapes, and like towards the end of it, I'm just picturing like a keyboard orchestra, everyone typing away a little bit.
Yeah, it is. And it's funny, I went down to there's a computer museum in Rhode Island, and I was looking, they because like Wang Computers was here for a long time, and so I was trying to find what maybe sounds for these like early computers, and the guys that I was talking to were like, oh well, that doesn't make sound. And I'm like, yeah, it does. They even just typing on different keyboards makes a slightly different sound. So the specific keyboard of a computer, that changes. And you think about the like early keyboards, from computers that had the really deep keys. I don't know if you've ever had to type on those. And now the keys are very shallow, and that makes a different kind of sound, right? So yeah, there's nuances to the way the technology changes and what that, and even just like, especially going through this project, it has put everyone I work alongside on high alert for sound. So they start paying attention to like all the little dings that their computers make. And even just, like pressing the buttons to set an alarm on a particular part of the building is part of the sound of work. The jangling of keys and things like that.
It's a really easy thing to take for granted.
Yeah,
because we're so in it and we're just naturally immersed. And I suppose desensitized to it. But I'm excited for this project to be able to juxtapose all these different periods together so that you can kind of get a lot of those textures. I do want to make time to talk about your second project as well, because when we first met, you were coming to LTC for some assistance when it came to getting some sound recording material. And then you also mentioned a podcast that you were doing. And then the initial idea and how that sort of shape-shifted a little bit into a new form. Could you speak a little bit on the podcast?
Yeah. So the original idea for the podcast, which is called Interwoven, Lowell Beyond the Looms, which is sort of crowdsourced with all of the park rangers and park staff who came up with that name. So they did a really great job. The original idea was to think about sort of some of the stories about Lowell that don't get told very often, and to have a kind of panel of guests. So it would be someone from the park, maybe some sort of scholar or expert who might give a sort of deep perspective. And we can then bring in lots of different voices. So we've been interviewing the park rangers who some of them have worked at the park since the exhibits opened in the early 90s. So they have a long perspective of those exhibits.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the podcast is kind of in an early stage of its production, and then your mid-production for the soundscape.
Yeah.
I'm really excited to hear more about these things. Do we have a sense of when you'd like to see these done and how folks can stay in? I know you are a partner with Mosaic. So
so I think the best place to kind of maybe keep up with the status of the project is the Mosaic Lowell website and social media feeds, because they'll probably throw up some updates. I know that they're also working on, putting out profiles of the composers that we're working with, so you can get to know them a little bit better. Our plan is to reveal the music with a silent disco event in August.
Very good.
So the details of that are still being worked out, but we're hoping that we can have something that is that allows people to hear the music sort of in a communal but individual kind of experience. And then, we also hope to have a program where the composers can sort of talk about their works in progress, probably coming up, in the next month or so.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, definitely stay tuned to Mosaic Lowell on social media if you're interested in keeping up with the project. Thank you so much for coming through and talking about some of this work.
Yeah, it was great.
My name is Wednesday. I'm a media specialist here at Lowell Telemedia. You've been watching The Lowellian, and this is our guest, Sarah.